Tolkien wished he had never written about elves in his books. Knowing that Tolkien's elves are one of the Lord of the Rings' most famous and beloved races, as well as perhaps Tolkien's single most impactful contribution to fantasy today, this may sound hard to believe, and yet it is, unfortunately, true. While the elves play an instrumental role in both the trilogy and The Hobbit, and they're also the sole focus of the professor's true lifelong passion project, the Silmarillion, later in life Tolkien would openly state his disappointment in having ever used elves within Middle-earth. In order to truly understand Tolkien's regret, let us first explore why he chose to include elves in his writings to begin with. Tolkien, as a medievalist, was deeply immersed in the legends and stories of the Middle Ages. It is no secret that he began his works wishing to write a mythology for his beloved England, and this immense undertaking ultimately developed into the Middle-earth that we know and love today. In the Middle Ages, depending on the when and the where, elves were perceived very differently. In the Germanic tradition that the professor adored so deeply, the elves were largely the ethereal and magical supernatural entities that we might imagine Tolkienian elves to be nowadays. They were beautiful, filled with light, and perhaps even a part of nature itself. This, in combination to his love of Norse mythology and the popular interpretation of its light elves, gave Tolkien the perfect idea and inspiration for his own fantasy race. After all, he wanted to create a pure, medieval-inspired experience, or better yet, myth. Within it, he contemplated life and death, immortality and mortality, the importance of nature, and so much more. Therefore, what a better instrument than to use an ancient mythological creature, ethereal and one with nature, than the ancient elves that he loved to read about in the old tales. A creature so distant from the human experience so as to capture the imagination and embody the true spirit of fantasy. Thus, the elves were chosen. Naturally, he made the changes that he wanted in order to fit his narrative and later world, but the themes and nature of his elves, the seriousness of them if you will, remained the same. The myth, at least the myth that he drew inspiration from, had to be respected. I say this as the elves took different forms throughout the Middle Ages and were even perceived by some to be demons. For Tolkien, the interpretation that we mentioned earlier is the one that he wished to replicate in his own mythology. Although he himself was satisfied with the word that he chose to call his fantasy people when it came to their origins and etymology, there was another issue. To Tolkien's never-ending dismay, elves in the period that he grew up in and lived, increasingly for the past few centuries, had changed dramatically since their early medieval interpretations. Throughout the early modern period, the French-originating fairies had become intertwined with the Germanic elves and spread to the British Isles. During this time, famous works such as those of Shakespeare and Drayton spread the idea of the elves as these very small, whimsical and mischievous magical creatures into the popular imagination, influencing writers and commoners alike for centuries. Ultimately, in the Victorian era, partly due to similar developments in Germany, which was itself influenced by England earlier, the view of the small elves or fairies with butterfly wings spread fast and had an instrumental effect in popular culture. The beautiful and ethereal elves of old mythology were nearly completely dead, something further cemented by the birth and spread of Santa's elves, largely in the United States. By the beginning of the 20th century, if you heard elf, you'd think of a small, nimble and mischievous magical creature, perhaps with wings, long noses, and large pointy hats. If Tolkien heard elf, he would think about the much older version of the myth, as this is what he had been exposed to and loved, and therefore this is why he chose the word despite the more popular connotations that he hated. While his works in our day and age are some of the most successful and popular pieces of literature ever produced, this is not how Tolkien obviously felt for the majority of his life, if at all. In fact, he had been deeply upset and perhaps regretful of what the dwarves had also become in the popular imagination, partly due to works by companies such as Disney, which in his eyes debased the ancient myths of Germanic mythology and turned them into a joke. For this exact reason, he insisted on spelling dwarves as shown on screen, instead of the correct and more popular dwarfs with an F, such as those of Snow White's. Although there is some debate as to whether this was originally a mistake on the professor's part, what can be said for certain is that he continued its use deliberately so as to differentiate his dwarfs from their alternatives. The same exact story applies to his beloved elves. In letter 151, written following the publication of the Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien comments that, "I now deeply regret having used elves, though this is a word in ancestry and original meaning suitable enough. But the disastrous debasement of this word, in which Shakespeare played an unforgivable part, has really overloaded it with regrettable tones, which are too much to overcome." He regretted having used elves to refer to the first children of Ilúvatar because he felt that what people would think about was this, which would ruin the feeling and the nature, the seriousness of the work. He didn't want the Quendi, which is the elves in their own tongue, to be in any way, shape or form thought to be in the same league as Christmas elves or the trickster fairies of modern culture, because he loved the elves in all of their ancient glory within mythology, and this is why he chose them in the first place. In other parts of his letters, he includes the in-universe justification of simply using the closest word that he could find in order to translate the ancient text that he had discovered, the Red Book written by Bilbo, Frodo, and others. This is because, in case you didn't know, within the story, The Lord of the Rings takes place in the distant past of our real world, and the text itself is Tolkien's translation of the account of our protagonists, as highlighted in letters such as 183 and 211. From this quote, however, especially with the release of his masterpiece in The Lord of the Rings, he must have felt that the modern view of the elves may be too much to overcome, and that he may have negatively impacted his own work by choosing that specific name for them, regardless of their inspiration. This is because he, naturally, didn't know the true scale of his work and his impact. While in his own lifetime he had experienced the incredible popularity that came with his books and the subsequent fame, he would never have been able to imagine that it was his works, his writings, that changed the elves forever. Yes, there had been other books in the past, such as The King of Elfland's Daughter and others, that had challenged the whimsical fairies, but it was Tolkien that changed them forever in every person's mind throughout the world. If I say the word elf now, while you may still think of Christmas or a fairy like Tinkerbell, the vast majority of people will visualize in their head a creature of light, wise and one with nature, immortal and fair, beautiful and spiritual. While Tolkien regretted the elves in his own lifetime, it was his writings that changed how this mythical creature had been perceived for the past 400 years, influencing a generation of writers and creators that then went on to create their own Tolkien-inspired elves, from Dungeons & Dragons to Warhammer and beyond. When Tolkien said that the elves had been overloaded with regrettable tones, he may have been right, but what can't be said for absolute certain is that these tones were never too much to overcome, and though Tolkien himself may have never truly lived to see the extent of his success, the elves today are what they are because of him. A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.